So we are going to be talking about how we can classify things. As we start moving forward in this section, which we'll test in a week and a half. A week from Thursday, which would be May 6th. May 6th. So when we are moving forward, we are going to talk about how we can look for, a lot of what we're going to be talking about from here on is talking about common ancestry and how closely related different organisms are. And there's different ways we can measure that, there's different criteria we can use for that. We could look at DNA and how similar DNA is versus two organisms. We could look at common characteristics, so how many traits do we share with another species? And we're going to talk about common ancestry. You got to go down one, the white sheet, Mr. Ward. Yeah, that one. So we're going to look at that. So a lot of our conversations is going to be evolving, not revolving, evolving, get it? Around the ideas of common ancestors. So we're going to start, by running through our section 3 notes from a week ago. These are not this Fridays, but the week ago Friday. I'm going to hit a few points, and I'm going to probably do the best that I've done all year of just making it quick. But the idea that we're going to talk about then leads us into how can we look at these relationships and what are some different ways that we can kind of classify these. So there's some tools we're going to use as a combination of like cladograms and DNA and taxonomy that we in science can kind of use to show how organisms are related. So this is again from like last week, a week ago, your virtual day. And I just want to hit some things. We talked a lot about this. Like almost all of last week's activities were based upon these ideas. So when we talk about a population, we should let me try that again. When we look at a population, we should make sure we know what a population is. And it's a group of individuals of the same species within a certain area. So a lot of times when we talk about population, we talk about like the population of Weston, Wisconsin. We define some boundary and then we count how many organisms, humans, are in that boundary. Now that changes when we talk about different species. If we were to talk about the population of deer in Weston, Wisconsin, well that's a whole different population, but our boundaries are still the same. So when we talk about population, it's a species in a location. The idea is there's variation in the gene pool, and with that variation, we get changes in the allele frequency. Now, how these genetic variations come around, there's really two different ways that we can get it. Is through random DNA mutations, or here it's called gene shuffling. In the video last Thursday, I think it was last Thursday, they refer to it as descent with modification. So if you look around the room, we have lots of variation within our population because your parents are different than my parents. Okay, and my grandparents are different than your grandparents. So even my sister and I have genetic variation, even though we have a common ancestor, my parents. So the idea is when that gene shuffling, it's from the kind of the combination of two different things, and this goes back to our meiosis unit. Independent assortment is how did those chromosomes line up? Was it blue-green or was it green-blue? Okay, they were independent of how chromosome pair number 1 lined up, chromosome pair number 2, and so forth. We also had this idea of crossing over where part of the chromosomes actually shifted from the mom homologous pair to the dad's homologous pair, and we got genetic variation within chromatids even. So we get this genetic gene shuffling, it can sometimes refer descent with modification. We get differences because of parents sexually reproducing within populations, organisms sexually reproducing. And if we look at populations, these are the same species of squirrel. We call them by name different, gray squirrel versus black squirrel, but they're the same species. It's just the color variation within their fur. Okay, so we have variation in our population around the room, just like the squirrel population does. So black squirrel, and you tend to find black squirrels in kind of pockets. Like, I'd say Wausau, Weston area, we have a fair amount of black squirrels. I don't think I've seen one in my backyard for a while. I used to every now and then. But if you go to another part of like the state, you might not see any. right? So the idea is there's some dark black squirrel genes in maybe this central Wisconsin area that aren't in northern Wisconsin or southern Wisconsin or in Illinois. I'm making that up. But the idea is because there's some, they can kind of be in pockets or subgroups. So we had this idea of natural selection, and what we start with is we start with a kind of common trend with a few kind of variations. But in most of the population is this variation, and these are rare. But if natural selection, nature just selects those traits that are advantageous or best fit for the ecosystem or the environment they're in, that if this red didn't survive, probably wasn't very fit. However, if this, I think it's black variation, becomes more prevalent and this one starts to diminish, it'd be a safe assumption to assume that this black color variation was advantageous or they were more fit for that ecosystem compared to this. So with time, the population starts to shift to meet the needs of, to be better fit or better suited for that environment. Now, in our bead bug, okay, this is kind of like our bead bug. We started with green and blue. Now, those green and blue were both relatively good, I'd say, in blending in. But I think most of you probably trended more towards green than blue. Am I correct with that? When you were done, you had more green than blue, or were they pretty equal? I don't know what your data looks like. You have to tell me what your data is. Were your blues and green pretty equal, or did you have slightly more greens than blue? Okay, that's kind of what I observed, just kind of walking around. But let's pretend that we started with blue and pink. Those were the two color variations we started with. What's going to happen to that pink? Probably pretty early, it's going to get picked off. Okay, but if the mutation, instead of the mutation being pink, the mutation would have been green, I think we would have seen something kind of like this happen, that we would have, the green population would have started to trend upwards, while the pink population would have started to probably drop pretty quickly. Okay, and it's the idea that over time we get some changes in these things. We call it genetic drift. Speciation, we did the speciation song, we played the speciation song. So the idea is if we have two individuals or two populations that get some form of isolation over a long period of time, this population is isolated from this population. There's no transferring of genetic variation, there's no crossbreeding. So if they're isolated long enough and enough differences accumulate within each population, that if and when they were brought back together, if they're able to successfully reproduce fertile offspring according to the biological species definition, if two organisms can reproduce and have fertile offspring so the babies can have babies, then they're the same species. However, if they can't or they don't, then we classify those as two different species. Lots of different things can cause those. It could be mating rituals, like day versus night. It could be the wrong dance. They talk about mechanical isolation. Their sex organs don't fit together anymore. Okay, they can't reproduce. Or even if they can reproduce and they do have offspring, but those are dead or infertile from the song, they are separate species. The mule was the example that was sterile. The tiger muskie was the example that we used that were sterile. There are two organisms that are able to successfully reproduce. However, their offspring are sterile, therefore two separate species. Speciation. This last piece is called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And the idea of this is in order for no genetic variation to occur within a population, which means a population is going to be static, never change in traits, they came up with this. There's 5 characteristics that have to hold in order for no genetic variation to be. So they call it genetic equilibrium. So everything genetically to remain absolutely the same. No drifts, no shifts, no evolution, no natural selection. So in order for basically if one of these 5 is not true, then species are going to change with time. That's what this is saying. So the idea is all mating has to be completely random. Completely random. Not just like, hey, that you know, like that particular, I'm a bird, and that bird is another bird in my population, time to mate, okay? Or, hey, look at that bird, it's got really nice feathers compared to that bird, I like those birds, it's prettier, okay? I'm gonna mate with that. That's not random if I'm choosing by plumage, okay? Looks, appearances. Mating rituals, dances. If I say, hey, that guy dances better than that guy, that's not random mating, okay? Completely random. Getting to know someone, having a good conversation, that's not random dating, or random mating, okay? The population has to be really large, no small subpockets. No species can move into or out of a location. They are isolated and they call it immigration and emigration. No new species come in and no new species leave. There are gonna be absolutely no mutations and no selection of favorable traits based on nature. Now, if you look at those 5 and say, but like most organisms are selective in their mating, true. Some of the populations are small, also true. There are some species that say, hey, I don't want to be part of this wolf pack anymore, and I'm going to leave and go to another wolf pack. True, okay? But there are mutations that occur. Also true. So the idea is if any one of these 5, and then that's not even talking about natural selection, but if any one of these 5 is true, then populations are going to shift. So ultimately what this is saying is populations are going to change. They're going to have genetic variation that continues to favor the idea of natural selection. Okay, and if, like I said, any one of those 5 is true, then species change over time. Okay, so that's that idea. Questions on section 3? Like I said, I think that was probably one of the quickest that I've gone through. All right, so in terms of like
In this way, eukaryotic animals have become
random, so kind of build off of that random mating. There are a population of birds, or a group of birds, I should probably call them, a group of birds in New Guinea
the
that are
male 12-wired bird of paradise is the only bird in the world.
that are commonly referred to as the birds of paradise. There's a lot, I don't know the answer. Do you know, there's how many different species? It might actually say it right here.
I think it's about 40, if I'm...
So there's these group of birds called birds of paradise. So in New Guinea, there's some very unique birds that are only really found there. And they've developed some pretty unique patterns, plumages, feathers, mating rituals, things like that. So what this, it's like four minutes long, shows an example of one of the birds of paradise doing a courtship dance. And the idea is, if the random mating, is if the female doesn't like the mating dance, or the male doesn't do a good enough job, she's gonna go try to find a different mate. However, if it's a good mating dance and is good, then they will mate. So the idea is sometime over long and many generations, the dance gets a little bit better, we'll call it better, and the dance kind of keeps evolving along with the mating. And those who don't do the right dance or don't dance well enough, they don't mate. And then those bad dancing genes that I credit are genetically too in humans. If you can dance, that's genetic. You can't, that's genetic as well. You get that from your parents. I don't know how to make that part up. Then that might have some impact. So the idea is just like a 4-minute video, then we'll move on. But it's kind of, so somewhere over many generations, many different years, that became the preferred mating dance. Why? There was a little bit of an aspect of it that was better than the next, or better than the other person's. I'm assuming all that is genetic in nature. We got very different mating rituals.
Wait, that was real? Is that his naturally changed colors?
What's that? That's actual footage from the mating rituals of that bird.
That did not look real.
Yeah, yep, that's actual footage.
There's a couple entire documentaries just on birds of paradise, because it's pretty far out there. It's pretty unique stuff. Some of those birds, what they do.
Yeah, and this particular clip came off of it was Our Planet, which is a series on Netflix, according to the title of it.
Yep.
So And I think there's an entire section called Birds of Paradise, or an entire episode based upon how this is kind of titled on YouTube about it. And so this is just like a 5-minute clip of Bird of Paradise. So that's the idea. That is what, but then like if another bird, even if it was capable, like egg and sperm of combining, if the other bird didn't do the right mating dance, they didn't win the approval, therefore there was no fertilization. So when we talk about isolation, that's one of the type of isolations that they do a different like mating dance, therefore not going to reproduce. Therefore, different species. So, yeah. Questions on speciation, genetic equilibrium, Hardy-Weinberg. Okay. Then, on the sheet you picked up today called The Diversity of Life, or just Diversity of Life, I guess it is, we are going to go through and we're going to talk, I'm going to talk you through the different kind of, the first 2/3, 3/4 of this sheet together. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each slide. Each slide represents some information on your worksheet that we're going to ask you to fill out. When we are done, there's a couple extra questions, additional questions that we are going to ask you to answer, and then this is a submission within Canvas for a practice to learn grade. So 3/4 of it will probably be done before you walk out, before I stop talking, and a lot of students had a couple extra minutes to finish that last few things to then go through. Now, if I'm going too fast for you, this is also linked in Canvas, so you can go through and you could fill in any missing piece along the way as well. So when we talk about how we classify organisms, the science of classifying is called taxonomy. So taxonomy is a science of classifying organisms based on biological characteristics. So there's different ways we can classify things, but when we talk about this type of classification system, it's based upon characteristics that they share in common, or certain traits. Where when we talk about a taxon, it's a level of classification. So what we are going to, and I kind of have it, it's on the next slide. Maybe you talked about this in 7th grade, kingdom, phylum, class, order, that whole thing. King Philip came over for great spaghetti is a memory device that I was taught and learned. And the idea is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And we can classify organisms by characteristics into these big, broad groups into very specific groups. And each taxa represents a group or a level. So when we talk about kingdoms, the two most common kingdoms that we talk about are the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. Okay, there's more, but those are the two common ones that we think about. So when we are talking about a taxon, it's one of these levels. So domain is a taxa, kingdom is a taxa, phylum is a taxa, okay, and so forth. And these taxa, and this is something, I think, do I ask them to fill this in later? This is not, I think so, right? Yeah, I question number 2, I guess I do. So when we look at all life, all living things can be classified by this system. So we talk about domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The memory device that I do is just represents the first letter of each name of King Philip came over for great spaghetti. That's the way I remember it. Okay, that's the way, and I honestly like to do it any other way. I actually have to say that in my head in order to make sure I put them in the order. But it's a way we can look at common ancestry. We can look at how closely related organisms are. That's the whole purpose of taxonomy, is to classify organisms, and then we can look at common ancestries, and we can look at genetic differences and similarities. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you from memory to go through and tell me kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, but I expect you to be able to go through and look at a sequence of these and then talk about relatedness and who's closer and further related. Okay? So when we talk about, we're going to draw these things called cladograms. And a cladogram is, I'm going out of order, I know. A cladogram is a branching diagram that shows the evolutionary histories and relationship between organisms. So it's kind of like a family tree. Okay, a cladogram is kind of like a family tree, but it shows evolutionary histories between organisms. So it's not talking about how am I related to Mr. DeBoer. It's talking about how is the human population, the human species related to daffodils? Or how are we related to a dog? Or how are we related to a dinosaur? Okay, so it's looking for evolutionary histories, and we're talking about common ancestry. And when we draw cladograms, we talk about clades. And a clade is a group of organisms that contain a common ancestor and all of the descendants of the ancestor. Okay, so if I'm talking family tree stuff, a clade would be a branch of my family tree. It'd be from my grandparents down. Okay, the clade would represent my common ancestors of my grandparents and all my cousins and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters along the way. That would be a clade. Okay, so a clade is a group where a cladogram is a diagram that shows multiple clades and how the multiple clades are related. So my clade for my family, Mr. DeBoer has a clade for his family. We could draw a cladogram to show how Mr. DeBoer and Mr. Davies somewhere have a common great grandparent. I'm making up the number of grades. Okay, but that's the idea. How are we related long ways away? But it's based on characteristics, not actual lineages. Okay, so clade is a group of organisms, where a cladogram is the diagram or branching diagram that shows how organisms are related between. Again, if I go a little faster than you would like, these are also going to be accessible via Canvas. There's a link to this. So when we go through and we draw these cladograms, the cladograms are based upon derived characteristics. So what a derived characteristic is a characteristic or trait that does not appear in a common ancestor or group, but it does occur later on. So it could be something along the lines of moms produce milk. Okay, and we call that a mammal. Now we need to make sure we have our masks on. I didn't think we need to make sure we're covering our noses and all that stuff too. So when we talk about derived characteristics, it's all common ancestors are going to have those traits. Okay, the ancestor above, or I guess it'd be below in the cladogram, doesn't have a trait, but that's what differentiates a fork. So like here's a common ancestor, everything this way has this characteristic, these don't have this characteristic. So it could be moms produce milk, which would make us mammals, right? Or what's a different derived characteristic? Walk on hind legs. Has a certain lobe on the brain. You know, has a foramen magnum, I think is the term we're going to use in a day or two. Has a spinal cord, has a vertebral column, things like that. Okay, so we're looking at a characteristic that differentiates between a different group. And that's going to be an important thing when we start drawing cladograms. We'll have a branch point at common ancestors, but beyond the branch, this way they have a characteristic, this way they don't. So we're going to look at these characteristics. So why is it important? Why is it important that we can classify these? Because it allows us to better identify and study organisms. We're going to be able to look and classify organisms based upon certain characteristics, and then we can look at ancestry, we can look at common behaviors, and we can look for similarities and differences. And maybe a population of a particular species is starting to become rare or endangered. Then based upon how we classify them, we can say, well, this one's close and this one did really well in this environment, therefore maybe we could do this to intervene. Or maybe we could take two organisms on opposite sides of the world, and if we look at their derived traits, maybe we could say, hey, these are close enough that maybe, fingers crossed, we could breed these two organisms together to save a species. I don't know if you're technically saving it if you're kind of starting to intermix, but whatever, that's the idea. We can look at these characteristics, and it allows us to study these organisms. So then we could talk about, this says, I think got fixed, good. There's 8 different groups that we look at. from least specific to most specific. So Mr. DeBoer also has them written on the board, I think, correct? I'm in the wrong meeting. Okay, so the 8 are, starting with domain, is the biggest category. So the most organisms are gonna fit under domain. And as we start going down, we get more specific and we start differentiating between groups. So we start with domains, then we go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So for example, phylum, we are all part of the phylum Chordata, which means we have we're chordates, which isn't, I mean, what I'm about to say is not the perfectly correct definition, but I'm gonna go with it because it will make it easier for us to understand. We have a backbone. Now that there are invertebrate chordates, but just if we throw that out there as general classification, we are under the phylum Chordates, which is different than the phylum Porifera, which is sponges. Okay, so both animals, both in the animal kingdom, but we are very different from sponges, sea sponges, but we have some common characteristics.
Dorsal notochord.
What's that?
The dorsal notochord.
Yep. Okay, so the idea then as we start working through, so like, oh, kingdom, animal kingdom, but phylum Chordates, okay, now we're talking like wolves and us are both in phylum Chordata. When we get to class, I think we're still good. Mammalia, so now we're all mammals. So wolves are still there, but now we got rid of earthworms. That's wrong because I already had chordates. But whatever. The idea is we can kind of start working through these things. And the further down we get in this list, the more specialized or the more specific we get, all the way down to species. There's only a organism that fits in the species. So we have the species name of sapiens. Our genus name is Homo. So we are referred to scientifically as Homo sapiens. There's other organisms that have the genus Homo, but Homo sapien is unique to modern human. Okay, so the more specific you get, or the further down this list you get, we get very specific in the organisms that we have.
1990 was domain. Looked it up.
Oh, 1990, so it was 30 years. 30 years, okay. So, Mr. DeBoer just mentioned domain. It used to, like when we were in grade school a long time ago, they just talked about kingdom, phylum, class. They never talked about domains. And that's relatively new in 1990. They decided that just talking about kingdoms wasn't good enough because there were too many kind of exceptions. So they added another more general branch called the domain. There's a couple of domains that we'll list here, and there's 3 of them that we're going to list in a little bit. So how do you know which taxonomic group has more organisms when comparing to? So the idea is the group is based on more general characteristics, will have more organisms than taxas that are, you should definitely paraphrase this, that group organisms based on more specific characteristics. So for example, phylum has more organisms than in class. We are all part of the animal kingdom. Like when I say we, or I'm saying all animals, let me rephrase that. All animals are part of the kingdom of Animalia. We're all part of the animal kingdom. Lots and lots of different organisms fall under the animal kingdom. But as I start working through like phylum of Chordata, now insects are not there. Now earthworms are not there. Now like clams aren't there. Okay, because I've started specializing a little bit. You know, I go mammals, reptiles are gone, amphibians are gone. Okay, and then we could even get into even more specific. But the idea is the further down this list we get, the less organisms there are. So higher up, the more, the lower, the less. You get more specific the further on you go. Okay? And there's 6 general kingdoms that we talk about. Talked about their defining characteristics. I'm just going to let's just talk about the 6. I'm good enough with that. Now, all of these are kind of weird names. Archaebacteria, Eubacteria, Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. He's like, what do you speak, Latin? And the answer is, I'm trying to speak Latin because I don't speak Latin. But all of these are written in Latin. So what is Plantae? Plants. What's Animalia? Animals. Okay, so we talk about the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. But there's 6 different there's 6 different kingdoms that we have. So fungi, we're talking like fungus and mushrooms, are different kingdom than plants. Why? Because they have different characteristics than plants. They have different characteristics than animals. They have some characteristics that we share. We're all in the same domain, okay? But they have some different characteristics. These are forms of bacteria, which is kind of interesting that they have their own kingdoms because the domains are almost specific to those as well, but it is what it is. So we have archaebacteria, eubacteria, protists or protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Those are the 6 kingdoms that they talk about when they talk about classifying organisms. So when we talk about the 3 domains, the big one that I'm going to say the biggest domain goes back to when we started studying cells. When we studied cells, we kind of classified cells into a couple different categories. We talked plants versus animal cells. That was one classification. But we also talked about eukaryotic cells versus prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, no nuclei. Eukaryotic cells, you are a eukaryote, you have a nucleus. So when we talk about eukaryotic cells, we are talking about a whole group of organisms that fall under the domain called eukaryotic. Again, I'm good if you write the 3 names down, but realize that this one is what all eukaryotic cells fall into. You are a eukaryote, therefore you're part of the domain of eukaryote. That daffodil outside has a nucleus. It's a eukaryotic cell. It falls under the domain of eukarya. Okay? The shark, the great white shark that I saw this weekend jump out of the Lake Wassa, is part of the domain of eukarya because it has a nucleus. Okay? Maybe it was the muskie on the end of Mr. DeWar's line. I couldn't tell. It's huge. That's all I know. Okay? So eukarya, any organism that has is eukaryotic, has a nucleus, falls under that very huge domain. Now I talked about that daffodil is the flower, is in the same domain as we are. That is that muskie that Mr. DeWar talked about. But now we can start specializing. Once we go one step down from domain to kingdom, that flower is in the plant kingdom, or the muskie in us, we're in the animal kingdom. So I have some characteristics in common with that plant, not very many, but I'm eukaryotic, it's eukaryotic. I have some similarities, not very many. Okay, so bacteria and archaebacteria are the 2 groups that are prokaryotes, that we kind of start way back when we say, hey, we got eukaryotic and prokaryotic. Prokaryotes kind of have their 2 different domains because those are unique enough that they have 2 separate bacteria groups, essentially, is what they have. So bacteria, archaebacteria, and eukarya. As long as you have those 3 titles, I'm good. Those are the 3 domains that we're going to talk about, or you are going to. And this is the last question we're going to go through together in class, and there's a couple different kind of bullet points with it. Is organisms are given a scientific name because using something called binomial nomenclature. Using the binomial nomenclature system. So nomenclature is naming. So when we talk about binomial nomenclature, it's a 2-name way to name an organism. So you are all probably familiar with the scientific name of humans as Homo sapien. 2 different names to describe Homo sapiens. Your dog, if you have a dog at home, its scientific name is Canis familiaris. If we talk about a gray wolf, the scientific name is Canis lupus. Canis familiaris, Canis lupus. The genus, I'm getting a little far, but they share the first name in common. That means they have a more common ancestor, more common, recent common ancestor than, say, a cat. Okay, like a wolf and a cat are not as closely related to a wolf and a dog. So, the scientific names are always going to be the same, no matter where you are in the world. That's one of the benefits of having a scientific name. We often use something called common name, like most of you and your friends probably don't go outside, like out in nature walking, like, oh, look, Canis familiaris. that's quite the Canis familiaris. It's so pretty. Okay? What a pretty dog, right? Or, I wish I knew more plant names. But you could be like, oh, look at the beautiful insert scientific name of some flower. Okay? But that's how scientists speak. And you can say, well, why? That's silly. It is, unless you're trying to speak like the same, make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. So a scientific name can only refer to a type of organism. Notice how I said Canis lupus and Canis familiaris. Those are two different species. Now, Mr. Davies, you said dogs and wolves can interbreed. Therefore, aren't they the same species? You're right. According to the biological species definition, they are two separate species. But according to this taxonomic naming classification system, they're separate species. They have different species. Okay. All of these are written in Latin. And the reason is it's an old, dead language that no one speaks anymore. It's studied, it's written in, but no one really speaks it. It's a dead language, which is good from the standpoint of it's static and it's not changing. We talk about the English language, we talk about slang words, things change with new meanings. If all of a sudden I come up with something and you guys think like, yeah, that's a great word, we just created a new word, or we gave an existing word a different meaning. But Latin doesn't do that because it's not being spoken. So when we talk about naming a scientific organism, it's always in Latin. The first letter is always capitalized, and the second letter is not, and it's either italicized or underlined. Somewhere it doesn't actually say this. It doesn't actually say genus species anymore. It doesn't. I don't think it does. When we go through this classification system, so we go king, phylum, class, order, genus, species, it's the genus species, the combination of the genus name and the species name are what come up with the scientific name that we refer to. So our genus name is Homo. Our species name is sapien. Therefore, our scientific name is Homo sapien, two parts. Wolf, I mentioned this a bunch of times, is Canis lupus, genus, Canis lupus is the species name. For dog is Canis, genus, familiaris, species. And if those two names are the same, they're the same species. Now, this idea of we can all refer to it as the same thing in every part of the world, there's certain plants that if I'm going in my garden or I'm walking through my grass, I'm like, oh, look at that thing. I hate those insert common name. And depending if you're in a different part of the country or you grew up somewhere else, you may refer to it as something different. Classic example that I like to use is a mountain lion. Okay, if I'm walking down the street and I see a mountain lion, I'd be like, oh my gosh, there's a mountain lion. And some of you might know what I'm talking about, but some of you would be like, what's a mountain lion? And if you were walking down the street, you might say like, oh my gosh, there's a cougar, okay? And I'd be like, what's a cougar? I thought that was a mountain lion. No, it's a cougar. They're the same organism. Or I'm walking down the street and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a puma. Okay, those are all the same common names for the same species. So when scientists write scientific journals, they always use the scientific name to eliminate that confusion of what are we talking about. Because some people might call it something the same, but they're really two different species. But like, hey, I call this a this, and you call this a this, and then, but they're really two different. Okay. What's that?
Oh, you know, like cougar, panther, puma, lion. Is there other species that do that?
There's like common names. Yeah, there's a lot of different common names. You know, flowers are like classic examples of where I might call a flower one thing, and you might call it something else. So that's really in science why we do this. Now, there's 3 questions that are still left for you to answer. Questions, I think, 7, 8, 9. And it's all based upon, hang on a second, I'm not done talking. Okay? So based upon those charts, there's 3 more questions for you to answer. And it's really interpretation of the kingdom, phylum, class, family, genus, species, and talking about relatedness. And the idea is more of those boxes that are the same, the more common their ancestors are more closely related there. And there's 3 questions. And all you got to do is answer those 3 questions. And I know we're down to here in 3 minutes, which is probably plenty of time for you to finish that and get that submitted in Canvas, so you don't have to worry about, oh shoot, did I open that back up? Did I fill that back in? You can get it taken care of before you walk out of here, because we still get 3 minutes. However, if you want to be on your way, have a wonderful day, everyone, but please make sure you submit this in Canvas.